The moment Abigail Crawford drove her elbow into the jaw of the first man who grabbed her, Theodore Fairchild knew with absolute certainty that he had never in his 31 years on this earth seen anything so remarkable, and he had seen buffalo herds that stretched from one horizon to the other. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Redrock, Texas sat baking under a merciless July sun that turned the main street to something resembling the surface of a cast-iron skillet left over a fire. Dust devils spun lazy circles between the buildings, and the smell of horses and leather and wood smoke hung over everything like a familiar old blanket. Redrock was not a particularly notable town. It had a general store run by a man named Horace Pettit who watered down his molasses and thought nobody noticed, a saloon called the Dusty Boot that served whiskey of questionable origin, a livery stable, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse during the week, a barber shop, a land office, and a jailhouse that had not held a prisoner in 3 months because the sheriff, a man named Gerald Dunmore, was more interested in the contents of the Dusty Boot than in the maintenance of law and order. Theodore Fairchild had ridden into Redrock 3 days prior on a buckskin gelding named Copper, trailing a small herd of cattle he intended to sell to a rancher named Augustus Webb who owned the largest spread in the county. Theodore was what people in that country called a drover, a man who moved cattle from one place to another for hire, though he was saving his money with a particular purpose in mind. He had his eye on a piece of land about 12 miles south of Redrock, a Sweetwater Creek bottom with good grass and enough timber to build something decent, and he was $200 short of being able to make that dream a reality. The Webb cattle drive had been his last job before he intended to settle down, and he had been telling himself that for 2 years, always finding one more job to take before the settling could begin. He was sitting on the wooden bench outside the Dusty Boot, his hat pulled low against the afternoon glare, drinking a cup of coffee he had talked the saloon keeper into making for him instead of whiskey, when he heard the trouble begin. The stagecoach from San Antonio had arrived an hour earlier, depositing 3 passengers and a locked strongbox that belonged to the bank, and was now residing safely behind the teller's window. 2 of those passengers had been merchants returning from a buying trip. The third had been Abigail Crawford. Theodore had noticed her when she stepped down from the coach, because it was impossible not to notice her. She was tall for a woman, with dark chestnut hair pinned up beneath a practical traveling hat, and she moved with a kind of contained energy that suggested she knew exactly where she was going and precisely what she intended to do when she got there. She wore a dark green traveling dress that was dusty from the road but held its shape with dignity, and she carried a leather satchel in one hand and a smaller carpet bag in the other. She was 26 years old, though Theodore did not know that yet. He would learn it later, along with a great many other things about her that would come to mean everything to him. He had watched her walk toward the general store with a purposeful stride, and he had thought to himself that she looked like a woman who did not need any assistance from anyone, and he had found that observation pleasantly refreshing and had gone back to his coffee. It was perhaps 40 minutes later when he heard the raised voices. He lifted his hat brim and looked down the street toward the alley beside Pettit's general store. 3 men had positioned themselves around Abigail Crawford with the calculated laziness of men who believed that their collective size made them untouchable by anything as inconvenient as consequences. Theodore recognized 2 of them. The taller one with the red bandana around his neck was a drifter named Cole Staggs who had been in and out of Redrock for years, doing odd jobs of the kind that decent people did not ask too many questions about. The second was his usual companion, a stocky man called Denny Marsh, who had a habit of laughing at things that were not funny. The third was a stranger to Theodore, younger than the other 2, with the look of a man who was trying very hard to appear more dangerous than he actually was. They had apparently decided that a woman traveling alone with a leather satchel was an opportunity not to be missed, and Cole Staggs had his hand wrapped around Abigail's wrist, while Denny Marsh stood blocking her path back to the main street, and the younger man leaned against the wall of the general store with his arms crossed, playing the role of lookout. Theodore set down his coffee cup and started to rise. He did not make it to his feet in time to do anything at all, because Abigail Crawford did not wait for assistance. Cole Staggs made the mistake of reaching for her satchel with his free hand, which meant he was occupied with two things at once, and Abigail used that half-second of divided attention to drive the point of her elbow directly into his jaw with a precision that suggested she had practiced the movement, or at least thought about it very carefully. The crack of it was audible from across the street. Staggs released her wrist and stumbled backward with an expression of pure astonishment on his face. Before he had fully registered what had happened to him, Abigail swung the leather satchel in a wide arc and connected it with the side of Denny Marsh's head. The satchel was apparently heavier than it looked, because Marsh went sideways into the wall of the alley and slid down it in an undignified manner. The younger man pushed off the wall with sudden alarm, reaching for the pistol at his hip, and Theodore was already moving, coffee forgotten, boots hitting the packed dirt of the street at a run. But even then, Abigail was faster. She had dropped the satchel, and her hand came out of the pocket of her traveling skirt, holding a small but entirely serious-looking derringer that she leveled at the young man's chest, with a steadiness that made Theodore slow his stride involuntarily. "I would put that back where you found it," Abigail said to the young man, and her voice was so calm and so perfectly level that it carried more authority than a shout would have. "I am not in a charitable mood today, and I have had a very long journey." The young man froze with his hand still wrapped around the grip of his holstered pistol, not having drawn it, not quite daring to move in either direction. Cole Staggs was sitting in the dirt holding his jaw with both hands and making a sound like a man who had just discovered that the world was significantly more painful than he had previously understood it to be. Denny Marsh was blinking at the wall he had slid down, as though he was not entirely sure how he had come to be acquainted with it. Theodore came to a stop about 10 feet from the mouth of the alley. He was aware that his mouth was slightly open, and he closed it deliberately. Abigail glanced at him, a quick measuring look that assessed him in about the same time it takes to draw a breath, and then returned her attention to the young man who had not yet moved his hand from his pistol grip. "I am going to pick up my bag," she said to the young man, "and then I am going to walk out of this alley. You are going to stand there and not do anything interesting. Do we understand each other?" The young man nodded with a speed that suggested complete and wholehearted agreement. Abigail kept the derringer level while she bent and retrieved her satchel from the dirt, shook it once to dislodge the dust, examined it briefly for damage, and then straightened. She glanced at Staggs still sitting in the dirt and at Marsh still communing with the wall. "Gentlemen," she said, with a tone that managed to convey both dismissal and a complete absence of apology, and then she walked out of the alley and directly past Theodore as though he were a fence post. Theodore turned and watched her go. She walked back toward the main street at the same purposeful pace she had used when she arrived, her satchel in one hand and the derringer still in the other, though she was in the process of returning it to her pocket. She did not look back. He stood there for a moment in the alley mouth with the 3 discomfited men behind him and the retreating figure of Abigail Crawford in front of him, and something shifted inside his chest that he could not immediately name. It was not simply admiration, though admiration was certainly a large component of it. It was something more particular than that. It was the feeling a man gets when he sees something that fits, the way a key fits a lock, the way water fits the shape of a river bed, the way a person can look at a piece of country and know immediately that it is where they belong. Theodore Fairchild looked at Abigail Crawford walking away down the main street of Redrock, Texas, in July of 1878, and he decided with the same quiet certainty that he used to pick good grazing land and trustworthy horses that she was the one he wanted beside him. The question of what to do about that decision was considerably more complicated. He turned back to the alley. Cole Staggs had gotten himself to his feet and was testing his jaw with careful fingers. Denny Marsh had stood up and was brushing dust from his shirt with the air of a man pretending nothing had happened. The younger man was already gone, having apparently decided that the prudent course of action was to be somewhere else entirely. "I suggest," Theodore said to Staggs and Marsh, keeping his voice very even, "that the two of you find yourselves something useful to do on the far side of town for the remainder of the day." Staggs looked at him with the particular expression of a man whose pride had been severely damaged and who was looking for an available target, but Theodore held his gaze with the patient steadiness of a man who has spent years moving large animals that do not want to be moved. And after a moment Staggs looked away and muttered something under his breath and walked off in the opposite direction from the main street. Marsh followed without saying anything at all. Theodore retrieved his hat from where it had fallen in his hurry across the street, knocked the dust from it against his thigh, and set it back on his head. Then he went to find Abigail Crawford. He located her at the hotel, which was a modest two-story affair on the north end of the main street called the Redrock Inn. She was at the front desk speaking with the proprietor, a thin man named Clive Morton, in a tone that suggested she was negotiating rather than simply making a request. Theodore waited near the door until she had concluded her business and turned around, and then he stepped forward and took off his hat. "Miss," he said, because he did not yet know whether she was married and he was not going to assume. "My name is Theodore Fairchild. I wanted to make sure you were all right." She looked at him with those clear hazel eyes that he had not been close enough to distinguish before, and he saw that they were neither purely green nor purely brown but something that shifted between the two depending on the light, and that they currently held an expression of polite assessment. "I am perfectly all right, Mr. Fairchild," she said. "I was all right before you came running, but thank you for the concern." "I know you were," he said. "I saw. I wanted to make sure you were all right in the manner of whether your wrist was injured, since that Staggs fellow had a grip on it." She glanced down at her wrist almost involuntarily, and he saw that there was redness there that would likely become a bruise by morning. She looked back up at him. "It is fine," she said. "A little sore." "Good," he said. He held his hat in his hands and was aware that he was not saying any of the things he actually wanted to say, which was the normal condition of a man standing in front of a woman who had just knocked two men sideways and made a third one freeze with a derringer and a tone of voice. "I am Abigail Crawford," she said, after a moment, with the air of someone who has decided that a proper introduction is appropriate regardless of the circumstances. "I am the new schoolteacher for Redrock." Theodore stared at her for just a fraction of a second too long. "The schoolteacher," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have a contract, 12 months beginning the 1st of September." She paused. "I can see that surprises you." "It does not surprise me," he said, which was not entirely true. It was not that he thought schoolteachers could not defend themselves. It was that the combination of the precise elbow strike and the steady derringer hand and the completely unruffled manner, and now the information that she was an educator for children made for a picture that was considerably more layered and interesting than anything he had expected. "Where did you come from?" "San Antonio," she said. "Originally from Georgia. I have been in Texas for 3 years." "Do you make a habit of traveling alone?" he asked, and then immediately recognized that it was the wrong question, the kind of question that implied she needed someone with her, and he saw the slight narrowing of her eyes that confirmed she had taken it that way. "I make a habit of traveling," she said with precision. "The alone part is circumstantial." "That was a poorly worded question," he said. "I apologize. What I meant to ask was whether those kinds of encounters are common and whether you have handled them before, because the way you handled that one suggested it was not your first time." The narrowing of her eyes softened slightly. "It was not my first time," she said. "My father was a soldier. He believed that his daughter should be able to take care of herself in a country that had not yet decided to take care of her." Theodore nodded slowly. He thought of his own father, a man of considerable practicality who had said something similar about the frontier, though regarding different specific skills. "A wise man," he said. "Yes," she said, and something shifted in her expression, something brief and private that suggested the man in question was no longer alive. He was. Theodore turned his hat in his hands. He was not by nature a man given to impulsive conversation with strangers. He was comfortable with silence in the way that people who spend large amounts of time alone often are. But he found that he did not want this conversation to end, which was an unusual enough feeling that it deserved attention. "Have you eaten?" he asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The stagecoach from San Antonio is a day and a half's travel with a midday stop," he said. "That means you have likely not had a proper meal since yesterday morning. The hotel keeps a fair table. If you have not eaten, I would be glad of the company for supper if you are willing." She studied him for a moment with those shifting hazel eyes. He held the look steadily, not pushing, not pulling back, just present. "I have not eaten," she said, "and I am very hungry. But I want to be clear that I am accepting your invitation because of the latter reason, and not because I require any manner of escort or protection." "Understood entirely," Theodore said, and he meant it completely. They ate in the small dining room off the hotel lobby, at a table near the window where the last of the evening light came in at a golden angle and turned everything amber. The food was simple: beef and biscuits and green beans cooked with fatback and strong black coffee. But after a day and a half on a stagecoach, it was as good as anything Abigail had eaten in recent memory. She learned that Theodore Fairchild was from Missouri originally, the youngest of 4 brothers, that he had come to Texas at the age of 19 to work cattle, and had never found a sufficient reason to go back. He was 31, lean and weathered in the way of men who work outdoors but not gaunt, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar when it was long enough, and gray eyes that she noticed had a habit of going still and thoughtful when he was listening to something that interested him. He spoke in the measured way of a person who considers words before using them, and he listened with the kind of complete attention that she had always found rare in anyone, but particularly rare in men she had just met. She told him about the teaching contract and about the school, which she had not yet seen, but which the county superintendent had described in a letter as modest but adequate, which she had learned over the years was county superintendent language for "in need of significant attention." She told him about her 3 years in San Antonio, where she had taught at a girls' academy run by Catholic sisters who had been excellent educators and occasionally terrifying. What she did not tell him, that first evening, was that she had come to Redrock in part because San Antonio had become uncomfortable after the dissolution of an understanding she had maintained with a man named Robert Hale, a cotton merchant of good family and poor character, who had spent 8 months making it clear to everyone in their social circle that the fault for the dissolution lay entirely with Abigail and her difficult nature. She had decided that difficult nature and a new town were better than easy compliance and familiar misery, and Redrock had been advertising for a schoolteacher for 6 months. Theodore did not press her for more than she offered. That, she noted. She filed it away alongside the gray eyes and the considered speech, and the fact that he had run across the street without being asked, and then managed to convey respect for what he had witnessed rather than embarrassment about arriving too late to be useful. They talked for 2 hours over coffee, while the dining room emptied around them, and the proprietor's wife cleared tables with the resigned air of a woman waiting for guests to finish at their own pace. When they finally rose to leave, Theodore held the door and she walked through it, and they stood for a moment on the hotel porch in the warm dark of a Texas summer night, with the stars enormous overhead and the sounds of the dusty boot drifting down the street, and somewhere out in the dark a coyote making its thin, lonesome sound. "Thank you for supper," Abigail said. "Thank you for the company," Theodore said. He put his hat back on. "I have one more day of business in Redrock before I need to move on. If you find yourself wanting breakfast at the hotel tomorrow, I will likely be here at 7. She looked at him. The lamplight from the hotel window caught the angles of his face and the particular steadiness of his expression. 7 o'clock is early, she said. I am up before 5, he said. 7 feels like a luxury. She found herself smiling in spite of herself. Then perhaps I will see you at 7, she said. She went inside. Theodore stood on the porch for a moment longer, listening to the coyote and the distant noise from the saloon and the settling sounds of the town at night. And he thought that the piece of land 12 miles south of Redrock with the Sweetwater Creek and the good grass had just acquired an additional appeal that he had not previously factored into his calculations. She was at breakfast at 7, and so was he. They ate eggs and cornbread and drank the hotel's serviceable coffee, and the conversation picked up with the ease of people who had already established a comfortable frequency with each other. Theodore told her about the land he was planning to purchase, describing it with a quiet specificity that told her he had been thinking about it for a long time and had walked it in his mind many times before walking it in his boots. Sweetwater Creek, she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. That sounds like a good name for a place. It is not called that officially, he said. That is just what I call it. What does the survey call it? Crawford Creek, actually, he said, and then stopped and looked at her with an expression of mild surprise. She raised her eyebrows. My family is from Georgia, she said. My grandfather came to Texas before it was a state. It is possible he named it. Is it possible, Theodore said, turning his coffee cup in his hands with a look of thoughtful consideration, that the piece of land I have been saving 3 years to purchase belongs to your family? My father's estate passed to my brother William when he died 4 years ago, she said. William lives in Houston. He has been trying to sell land he cannot manage from a distance for 2 years now. Theodore looked at her for a long moment. Well, he said. Well, she said. I was $200 short of the asking price, he said. What is the asking price? He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have a letter of introduction to the land office here. My brother asked me to stop in Redrock and speak to the agent about the property. He wanted someone with eyes on the ground, as he put it. And here you are, Theodore said. And here I am, she said. They looked at each other across the hotel breakfast table while the morning light came through the windows and the town of Redrock began to wake up around them, and the coincidence of it sat between them like something that had been placed there deliberately by a force with a very particular sense of humor. I would like to see it, Abigail said. The land, before I write to William. I could take you out there today, Theodore said, if you are willing to ride. I can ride, she said. He had learned by this point to take her statements of capability at face value. Then let us go see it, he said. Horace Pettit at the general store had a reasonably gentle mare he was willing to hire out by the day, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, Theodore and Abigail were riding south out of Redrock on the road that became a track that became a faint line through tall grass, with Copper moving easy beneath Theodore and the hired mare, whose name turned out to be Sally, moving with a placid willingness that suited Abigail's no-nonsense riding style. The Texas Hill Country in July was a specific kind of beauty that required some adjustment to appreciate. It was not the lush green beauty of the eastern states or the dramatic grandeur of the mountains. It was a harder beauty, all caliche rock and cedar and scrub oak and the particular silver-gold color of the grass in the heat of summer, and the sky above it was the deep uninterrupted blue of a place with very little to interrupt it. The air smelled of cedar and hot stone and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that had managed to survive the heat. Theodore said very little as they rode. He was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not demand filling. Abigail rode beside him and watched the country and let herself simply be in it, which was something she had not done in a long time. San Antonio was a city, loud and busy, and full of other people's expectations. This was something entirely different. After about an hour and a half, Theodore pointed ahead to where the land began to drop slightly toward a line of heavier trees that indicated water. There, he said. They rode down into the creek bottom, and it was, she thought, exactly what he had described. The creek ran clear and steady over limestone rock, shaded by a corridor of pecan trees and live oaks that turned the air 10 degrees cooler than the open ground above. The grass in the bottom was thick and green even in July. The land on the opposite bank rose gently to a low ridge that would catch morning sun and shelter from north wind in winter. It was about 300 acres in total, and it had the feel of a place that had been waiting. Abigail dismounted without being helped because she did not need help and walked to the edge of the creek and stood looking at it. Theodore dismounted behind her and let Copper drop his nose to the water. "My grandfather homesteaded this in 1842, she said, more to herself than to him. "He built something here. My father grew up here." She paused. "My father died in Virginia at a place called Cold Harbor in 1864. "I am sorry," Theodore said, with the quietness of a man who understood that some losses do not diminish. "He was a good man," she said. "He would have come back here after the war. He always said he would." She looked at the creek and the trees. "William does not want it because it is too far from Houston, but he cannot bear to give it away, so he has been asking more for it than anyone has been willing to pay." "Until now," Theodore said. She turned and looked at him. The creek light was filtering through the pecan leaves and making patterns on the ground between them, and she thought that Theodore Fairchild standing in her grandfather's creek bottom looked like a man who had always been supposed to be there. "I will write to William tonight," she said. "I will tell him to accept your price." Theodore looked at her. "Miss Crawford," he said, and then stopped and started again. "Abigail, I need you to know that I would purchase this land at full asking price if I had the means. I am not asking for a reduction because of any connection between us. I do not want you to feel obligated." "I am not the kind of woman who does things because she feels obligated," she said. "You know that already." "I know that," he said. "Then I will write to William," she said, and the matter was settled in the way of people who understand each other. They ate the lunch that Theodore had packed in his saddlebag, sitting on a flat limestone rock beside the creek, bread and dried beef and apples, and a jar of cold water. They talked about the land and what could be built on it, and where the house should sit to catch the prevailing breeze. Abigail had opinions that were detailed and practical and clearly the product of someone who had thought about such things before, and Theodore listened to them with the complete attention she had already noted as characteristic of him. She told him then about Robert Hale, not everything, but enough. She told it plainly, without drama or self-pity, the way you describe a stretch of bad road rather than a catastrophe. Theodore listened without interrupting, and without offering the kind of retroactive advice that would have been both useless and annoying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Any man who requires a woman to be less than she is in order to feel secure is a man who already knows he does not deserve her." She looked at him. "That is a very direct statement," she said. "I am a direct person," he said. "So am I," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other across the flat rock, with the creek running beside them and the afternoon sun coming through the trees, and something passed between them that was not yet anything that could be called by a formal name, but that had the weight and quality of something that would be. They rode back to Redrock in the golden light of late afternoon, arriving just as the town was settling into its evening rhythm. Theodore returned Sally to Pettit's stable and Abigail went to the hotel to write her letter to William, and when she came back down to the dining room for supper, Theodore was already at the table by the window. She sat down across from him and said, "I have written the letter. It will go out on the morning stage." "Thank you," he said. He met her eyes. "I should tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I am going to be here in Redrock for the next month at least, while I wait for the land transaction to complete and begin making arrangements," he said. "I realize you have just arrived and are trying to establish yourself here, and I do not want to be something that complicates that. I am also aware that we met yesterday and that telling you what I intend to say might seem precipitous." "Tell me anyway," she said. "I would like to spend time with you," he said. Honestly and openly in whatever way is comfortable for you, not because I need something from you. Just because I think you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever met, and I would like the opportunity to know you better, and I would like you to know me. Abigail sat with that for a moment. The evening light was doing the same thing it had done the night before, turning everything amber and honest. I would like that too, she said, on the understanding that I have come to Redrock for my own reasons and my own purposes, and that those do not change regardless of any other development. I would not want them to change, he said. I told you. I think a man who needs a woman to be less than herself is a man who does not deserve her. I did not say that as an abstraction. She smiled then, really smiled, for the first time since they had met, and it changed her whole face into something that made Theodore's chest tighten in the very specific way of a man who understands that he is in considerable trouble and is not remotely sorry about it. The month that followed was one of the most vivid periods of Theodore Fairchild's life, and he had lived a life that contained a number of vivid periods. Every morning he had breakfast with Abigail Crawford. Every afternoon he worked on the arrangements for the land purchase, met with the land agent, dealt with the practical business of transitioning from a man who moved cattle to a man who would settle on his own ground. Every evening he had supper with Abigail, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, about books she had read and trails he had ridden, about the war that had taken her father and the drought of 1876 that had taken 3 years of his savings, about what she wanted to build at the school and what he wanted to build on the land, about the particular character of the Texas sky at different hours and in different seasons. He took her riding in the evenings when the day had cooled to something bearable. She took to the hill country with the same contained intensity she applied to everything, noting things, asking questions, learning the country the way a teacher learns a subject, systematically and with genuine curiosity. She was not romantic about the wildness of it the way some people from cities could be. She saw it clearly and honestly, the beauty and the hardness of it together. She explored the school building, which was exactly as dire as she had suspected from the superintendent's letter, and she wrote a detailed assessment and list of requirements that she sent to the county office with a firmness of tone that Theodore found very amusing when she read parts of it aloud to him over supper. They said adequate, she said, looking at her letter. What does it need? He asked. New roof, new benches, books because there are none, chalk and slates. A wood stove that does not actively present a fire hazard. She paused. Desks. The window shutters are missing on 2 windows. That is a considerable list, he said. It is a reasonable list, she said. These are children. They deserve a room that is fit for learning. Theodore thought about that. Then he said, I know something about carpentry, and I have time between now and when I can break ground on the homestead. She looked at him. I'm not asking for help, she said. I know you are not, he said. I am offering. There is a difference. She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said, there is a difference. He spent 3 days on the schoolhouse roof with a local carpenter named Eli Washington, a freed man who had come to Texas after the war and built a small but steady business in Redrock. Eli was a careful and exacting craftsman who had very little patience for shoddy work, and he and Theodore got on immediately on the basis of shared professional standards. Abigail came every day and worked on the inside of the building while they worked on the outside, scrubbing walls and repairing benches and cleaning out the accumulation of 2 years of disuse. The county sent most of what was on her list, though the books were fewer and older than she would have liked, and she supplemented them with a careful selection from a bookshop in San Antonio that she ordered through Pettit's store. Theodore built new desks from cedar planks he sourced from a mill 30 miles away, working in the evenings in the livery stable where there was enough room, and Eli finished them with a smooth plane that made them something Abigail genuinely admired when they were installed. On an evening in early August, with the school nearly ready and the land deal completed and the deed to the Crawford Creek property in Theodore's possession, They were sitting on the bench outside the schoolhouse in the cooling air after an evening's work, and Abigail said something that had been on the edge of her thoughts for some time. "You are building something here," she said. "Not just the land." "Here in Redrock." He looked at her sidelong. "I suppose I am," he said. "It suits you," she said, "being in a place." "It does," he said. "I have been in motion for a long time. I think I am ready to be still." "I am the opposite," she said. "I have been in places that felt like cages. I needed to be in motion for a while." She paused. "I think perhaps I am beginning to understand what might make a place feel different from a cage." He was quiet for a moment. The evening sounds of Redrock drifted through the warm air. "What makes the difference?" he said, though he had a feeling he knew, and he wanted to hear her say it. She turned and looked at him directly. "The difference," she said, "is whether you are there because you chose it or because you were put there. The difference is whether the person beside you sees you or only what they need you to be." "Yes," Theodore said simply. She held his gaze. "I see you, Theodore Fairchild," she said. "You are steady and you are kind and you are honest and you are braver than you show and you listen like it matters and you build things as though they are meant to last." He turned on the bench to face her more fully. "I see you," he said. "You are strong in the way that matters, the kind that comes from inside and does not depend on what anyone else decides to think of you. You are brilliant and you care deeply about things and people while pretending to be more detached than you are. You have a laugh that you do not use nearly enough, and when you do it is one of the best things I have ever heard." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been careful for a long time." "I know," he said. "I do not want to be as careful as that anymore," she said. "I am tired of it." He reached out and took her hand, the one with the faded bruise from Staggs's grip that had gone yellow and was nearly gone now, and held it gently, giving her every opportunity to take it back. She did not take it back. "Then do not be," he said. "Not with me." She looked at their hands and then back at his face. "This is a risk," she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said yet. "Yes," he said. "I am not good at failing at things," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "So let us both try very hard to be good at this." She laughed then, that laugh he had described, full and warm and genuinely surprised out of her, and he thought it was exactly as he had told her, one of the best things he had ever heard. He leaned in and kissed her, slow and careful. "The way you handle something you know is valuable." And she kissed him back with a warmth and directness that was entirely and perfectly in keeping with everything he had learned about her. August in Redrock was a month that moved slowly, in the way of very hot months, and Theodore worked on the homestead during the days, making the preliminary arrangements, clearing a building site, digging a well with the help of 2 men he hired from town. He stayed at the hotel for now and rode out to the land in the mornings and came back to town in the evenings. He and Abigail had their standing supper arrangement and their evening rides, and the residents of Redrock, who had very little that was new to pay attention to, paid attention to them with considerable interest and a mostly benevolent speculation. Cole Staggs and Denny Marsh left Redrock the week after the incident in the alley. No one was entirely sure where, and the younger man whose name turned out to be Pete Connell stayed but became notably respectful of Abigail whenever their paths crossed, which she received with a cool pleasantness that she maintained regardless of what she was thinking, which Theodore had learned to find privately funny. Sheriff Dunmore, roused to something resembling professional interest by the alley incident, came to speak with Abigail about it and was evidently somewhat taken aback by her account of it. He recovered sufficiently to express satisfaction that the matter had resolved itself without further incident, and then went back to the dusty boot. Theodore, who had very little patience for men who wore a badge as a formality, kept his opinions on the sheriff to himself in Abigail's company, though Eli Washington had similar opinions expressed with more eloquence when they were working together. Eli Washington and his wife, Clara, became friends to both Theodore and Abigail in the way that good people become friends, naturally and without drama. Clara was a small, precise woman with an extensive practical knowledge of the Texas Hill Country's plant life, and a willingness to share it that Abigail found invaluable for understanding the region she was now going to call home. Clara had 2 children, a boy named Samuel who was 7, and a girl named Ruth who was 5, and they would be among Abigail's students in September. The school opened on the 1st of September with 14 students ranging in age from 5 to 13. Abigail stood at the door of the freshly repaired building on that first morning and received her students with the combination of warmth and absolute authority that Theodore had already come to understand as characteristic of her at her professional best. And he watched from across the street for about 5 minutes before going out to the homestead, because a man standing across the street watching something was only charming for a limited amount of time before it became peculiar. He was making real progress on the homestead. The well was dug and good, hitting water at 22 feet with a sweetness that justified the name he had given the property. He had contracted Eli to help build the house, a 2-room structure initially with the intention to expand, placed on the south side of the creek bottom where it would catch the morning sun and be sheltered from the north wind by the low ridge, exactly as he and Abigail had discussed on that first afternoon sitting on the flat limestone rock. She rode out to the property every Sunday. They would walk the creek and talk about the week and the work and the progress of each other's various projects. She had reorganized the school's curriculum in ways that were apparently causing some discussion among the parents, not because the changes were wrong but because they were unfamiliar, and she was navigating the social currents of a new community with the combination of confidence and genuine interest in people that made her effective at it, though it cost her more than she always showed. "Mrs. Calloway came to speak with me today," she told him one Sunday afternoon, sitting on their limestone rock with her boots off and her feet in the creek while Theodore sat beside her. Mrs. Calloway was the wife of the most prosperous rancher in the area after Augustus Webb, a woman of strong opinions and considerable social influence. "What did she want?" Theodore asked. "She wanted to know why I was teaching the girls the same curriculum as the boys," Abigail said. "She felt that the girls would benefit more from practical domestic instruction." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that the girls would receive instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and natural science, the same as the boys, and that any girl who wanted to learn domestic management could do so in her own home from her own mother, who was presumably more qualified than I was in that regard." She paused. "I may have said that last part a little more directly than was strictly diplomatic." Theodore looked at the creek. "How did she receive it?" "She was quiet for a moment," Abigail said, "and then she said that she supposed I had a point about the mothers and that her own daughter had shown an aptitude for arithmetic that she had not known what to do with." She paused again. "So I think we are all right." "You are all right," Theodore confirmed. She pushed him with her shoulder, and he pushed back gently, and they sat in the warm afternoon with the creek running over the limestone between them and the pecan trees making their particular sound in the September breeze. And it was so perfectly comfortable that it did not require anything added to it. But Theodore was a man with a direction, and he had been thinking carefully for some weeks about a particular conversation. And on that Sunday afternoon in mid-September, with the October purchase of the lumber for the house expansion in his plans and the first crop of winter wheat he intended to put in before the cold came, he decided that he had been thoughtful long enough. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and brought out a ring, a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone set in it that he had purchased from a traveling jewelry dealer 3 weeks earlier, carrying it since then against the particular occasion for which he had been waiting. Abigail looked at it in his hand and then up at his face, and she went very still in the way she went still when something was genuinely unexpected. "Abigail Crawford," he said, looking at her steadily. "I have spent the last 3 months getting to know you, and every day of it has confirmed something I understood in the first 5 minutes. You are exactly who you are without apology and without pretense, And that is not a common thing, and it is not a small thing. I love you. I love your mind and your courage and your stubbornness when you are right, which is most of the time, and your laugh that you keep like it is precious, and the way you talk to children like they are people worth talking to properly. He paused. I want to build this life with you. On this land that has your grandfather's name on it and your father's memory in it. I want to build the house and the farm and the years, and I want to do it beside you, as your equal, your partner in all of it. I am asking if you will marry me. The creek ran over the limestone. A mockingbird made its multiple voices in the oak tree overhead. The September sun was warm and the breeze was cool, and Abigail Crawford sat looking at Theodore Fairchild with an expression that he could not quite read and then could, because it was the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something she was not sure she would ever find and has just found it. Yes, she said. Theodore Fairchild, yes. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it. This practical no-nonsense woman who had driven her elbow into a man's jaw without blinking. And her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the creek light. And he pulled her into his arms and held her with the care of a man who knows what he has and intends to keep it safe. They were married on the 14th of October, 1878, in the little church in Redrock that doubled as Abigail's schoolhouse during the week. It was a Tuesday, because Abigail did not want to take a full weekday away from the children, but she also did not want to be married on a Sunday, and she did not see why a Tuesday could not perfectly well accommodate a wedding. The Reverend Gerald Hatch, a mild and agreeable man who had built his congregation on the principle that God preferred kindness to argument, performed the ceremony. Eli and Clara Washington were there. Clara in her good blue dress with Samuel and Ruth, scrubbed to a brightness that suggested Clara Washington's views on presentation for formal occasions. Augustus Webb came, the rancher who had hired Theodore's last cattle drive, a big square man of 60 who had an unexpected sentimentality about weddings that sat oddly with his general manner but was genuine. A dozen other townspeople filled the benches, including Mrs. Calloway, who had apparently decided that the new schoolteacher was worth supporting, and Horace Pettit from the general store, who wept in a quiet, personal way during the vows that surprised everyone, including himself. Abigail wore a dove-gray dress that she had made herself with Clara's help, simple and well-fitted with small buttons of pearl at the cuffs, and she carried a bunch of wildflowers that Ruth Washington had collected with great seriousness from the creek bottom at Theodore's request. She walked down the aisle of the church without anyone escorting her, which had caused a brief conversation with Reverend Hatch that she had concluded to both their satisfactions, and she stood before the altar and looked at Theodore Fairchild in his good shirt and his brushed hat held in both hands and his gray eyes steady and bright, and she thought that she had made very good decisions to bring her here. Theodore thought he had never seen anything as beautiful as Abigail Crawford on that Tuesday morning, which was the same thing he would think every morning for the rest of his life, though he would not always express it with the same formality. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, and they meant them, and everyone in the room knew they meant them, which is the condition that makes a wedding ceremony into something more than a legal arrangement. They had a wedding supper at the hotel that evening, simple but good, and afterward Theodore helped his new wife onto Copper behind the saddle, which Sally, the hired mare, having been available, was perhaps unnecessary, but which was the way they had ridden home together that first time, and which felt correct for this occasion. They rode out of town in the cool October evening with the stars beginning to appear overhead, and Theodore pointed Copper south toward Crawford Creek, and the not yet finished house that had 2 rooms completed, and a third framed in, and Abigail held on to him with her arms around his waist and her chin on his shoulder, and watched the Texas dark open up around them. "Tell me what the house looks like when it is finished," she said, the way she had asked him to describe it before and the way she always found the description better than anything she had seen yet. 3 rooms to start," he said, "and then 4 when there is need. The south wall will have 2 windows to catch the light. The fireplace is stone from the creek. The porch faces east for the morning." He paused. "The kitchen garden is yours. I have cleared the space Clara said was best for it." "Clara knows her plants," Abigail said. "She does," he said. "The pecan trees are ours, and the creek is ours, and the ridge behind catches the north wind so we do not." She pressed her cheek against his shoulder blade. "Theodore," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad I got on that stagecoach," she said. He put one hand over hers where it rested against his ribs, and he felt her fingers curl into his. "So am I," he said. "Every day I will be glad of it." They came to the creek in the dark, the sound of it reaching them before the sight of it, the cool of the water-held air, the smell of pecan and cedar, and Copper picked his way down the familiar track without needing guidance. The house stood in the moonlight, squared and solid, the chimney dark for now, the windows without glass yet but covered with oilcloth against the weather. It was not finished, but it was real. Theodore helped Abigail down, and they stood in the moonlit yard of their home, incomplete and exactly right. And he thought that this was the thing he had been riding toward for 12 years without knowing what shape it would take when he arrived. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a working season. Theodore broke ground on his first fields in the sandy loam of the creek bottom, good soil for the winter wheat, and the spring planting he was planning. He expanded the house to 3 full rooms before the cold set in, and Eli came out twice a month to help with the larger tasks. Theodore bought 4 cows from Augustus Webb, a solid breeding stock decision, and built a small barn south of the house that was warm enough for the animals and tight enough to store feed. Abigail taught school through the week and came home on Fridays with a saddlebag full of papers to mark and a mind full of the week's particular challenges and triumphs. She had expanded the school's enrollment to 17 students by November, drawing children from ranches further out whose parents had decided the improved school was worth the longer ride. And she was in correspondence with the county superintendent about adding an additional half-day session on Saturdays for the older students who needed more preparation for the practical arithmetic of farm and ranch management. The county superintendent, a man named Fletcher who had originally expected the new teacher to last 1 semester before returning to the city, was discovering that his expectations required revision. The Redrock schoolhouse in the winter of 1878 was a place of real activity. Abigail had organized the books she had acquired into a small lending library that parents could borrow from, which had been controversial at first on grounds that adults did not need a schoolteacher telling them what to read, and then had become unexpectedly popular. Clara Washington was the most enthusiastic participant and was working her way through a geography series with a methodical pleasure that suggested she had always wanted access to exactly this kind of material. Abigail and Theodore had their evenings and their Sundays, and the particular intimacy of 2 people building a shared life from the ground up, every practical decision a conversation, every solved problem a small shared victory. They argued sometimes because they were 2 strong-willed and direct people, and their arguments were vigorous and honest and resolved without residue, which is the only kind of argument that is actually productive. She was fierce about the school, and he was patient about everything except injustice, which they both were fierce about. And there was a great deal of injustice to be fierce about in Redrock in 1878 and 1879. Eli Washington was a man of evident skill and good standing, and still encountered the particular daily indignities that the post-war South imposed on freed black men, and Theodore and Abigail were both specific and practical in their response to it. Theodore hired Eli for work that paid a fair wage and said so publicly when anyone suggested it was too much. Abigail made sure Samuel and Ruth Washington received exactly the same education as every other child in her school, and when a parent raised an objection, she responded with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. They were not saving the world. They were doing what they could in the place they were, which is the best any person can manage. In February of 1879, Abigail told Theodore on a Sunday morning over coffee in their kitchen that she was expecting a child. She said it matter-of-factly, watching his face, and what she saw on his face was such uncomplicated and total joy that she felt her own expression open in response to it in a way she had not entirely anticipated. He stood up from the table and came around it and cupped her face in both his hands and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned meant everything when they went still like this. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the right first question. "I am very well," she said. "I feel entirely normal except for a persistent opinion about oatmeal in the mornings that I am choosing not to act on." He laughed, that quiet, full laugh of his that she had also learned to love. Then he kissed her forehead and sat down again and took both her hands across the kitchen table, and they talked about it the way they talked about everything, practically and honestly, and with the underlying warmth that was by now so familiar a part of their daily life that she sometimes forgot to notice it the way you forget to notice good weather until you think about it. Spring came to Crawford Creek with the determination that spring in the Texas Hill Country always shows, the bluebonnets carpeting the slopes above the creek, the pecans leafing out in their stately way, the wheat in the fields coming green, and the garden that Abigail had planted in the plot Clara had designated taking hold in the dark soil. Theodore added 2 more cows and began planning the kitchen expansion that would be needed before autumn, and Abigail's school enrollment reached 22 students and stayed there, which was the capacity of the building without additions. She wrote to the county superintendent about additions and received an acknowledgement that was encouraging without being definitive, which was county superintendent for, "We will consider it when we must and not before." And she filed it away and began identifying which local citizens had the most influence on the county board and what their various interests were, in preparation for a more strategic approach. Theodore watched her work through this problem one evening while they sat on the porch in the April warmth, and he said, "You are going to get that building built." "I am going to get that building built," she agreed, without looking up from the letter she was composing. "You are terrifying," he said with complete affection. She looked up then and smiled at him over her paper. "You love that about me," she said. "Completely," he said. On the 11th of September, 1879, their son was born, and they named him James Crawford Fairchild, James for Theodore's father and Crawford for the creek and the heritage and the grandfather who had stood on this land before him. He was born on a Sunday morning with Clara Washington in attendance, because Clara had delivered a number of babies and had no patience for fuss, and Theodore waited in the kitchen in a state of contained anxiety that was visible to anyone who looked at him, and that he was not successfully managing to hide. When Clara came to the kitchen door and said that Abigail was well and the baby was well and it was a boy, Theodore sat down very suddenly in his kitchen chair and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds in a way that was not quite crying, but was the next closest thing. Then he stood up and went in to see his wife and his son. Abigail was exhausted and glowing and entirely herself, and she held the baby with the direct, practical care she applied to important things, and when Theodore sat on the edge of the bed beside her and she put James Crawford Fairchild into his arms, the look on Theodore's face was the look of a man who has just understood the full weight of what his life is worth. "He looks like you," Abigail said. "He looks like a baby," Theodore said. "He looks like a very handsome baby who is going to look like his father," she said. "He looks like the best thing I have ever had a hand in," Theodore said quietly, and he meant it absolutely. Clara stayed for 3 days to help, and in that time she reorganized the kitchen to a configuration that was more efficient and made her observations on the subject of infant management with the directness that was as characteristic of her as it was of Abigail. And the 2 women got on in the particular way of strong-willed women who recognize in each other an equal. Abigail returned to school in November, which was later than she had originally planned but earlier than Theodore had hoped, and she brought James in a basket for the first 2 weeks until she established a satisfactory arrangement with Mrs. Webb, Augustus Webb's wife, a practical woman in her 50s who had raised 5 children and was now suffering from an excess of grandchild-deprived energy and was very glad to have a specific infant to direct it toward. The school continued to grow, and the farm continued to develop, and the house continued to expand. A 4th room added in the spring of 1880 in anticipation of the possibility of future family expansion. And the kitchen garden became a kitchen and kitchen garden together, when Theodore built the summer kitchen that Clara had specified as necessary for managing the heat of Texas cooking in July and August. In the spring of 1880, Cole Staggs reappeared in Redrock, which was not a welcome development. He had acquired a manner of studied rehabilitation, presenting himself as a man who had left his previous life behind, and Sheriff Dunmore, who could be relied upon to take the path of least resistance, accepted this presentation without undue scrutiny. Theodore heard about Staggs's return at the general store and came home that evening and told Abigail, who received the information with the level eyes of a woman who was not particularly worried but was paying attention. "He will not bother you," Theodore said. "Not after what happened in that alley." "No," she said thoughtfully. "He will not bother me, but I am watching him." It turned out that Staggs had returned with a specific purpose, which was a business proposition connected to a land surveying dispute on the western edge of the county that involved some creative interpretation of property boundaries that did not hold up to examination. This came to light within 6 weeks of his return, when the rancher whose land was being quietly encroached upon discovered the discrepancy and brought it to the land agent. And the land agent, who had been conducting his business with more diligence than Sheriff Dunmore, brought it to the county marshal, who was a different and more reliable figure of law than the local sheriff. Staggs left Redrock again, this time under circumstances that made his return inadvisable, and that was the last that Redrock saw of him. Theodore noted his departure with satisfaction and without drama. Abigail noted it in the same manner. The years built themselves. Theodore's farm grew from the original creek bottom planting to include the lower slopes of the ridge, where he put in fruit trees, apples and peaches, that would take years to mature, but that he planted with the patient certainty of a man building for time. He added a proper chicken house and expanded the cattle herd gradually and carefully, always keeping his numbers within what the land could properly sustain, which was the difference between a farmer and a man who mined his ground until it failed him. Abigail's school received its addition in 1881, after a sustained campaign in which she mobilized Mrs. Calloway, who had become a genuine ally, and several other influential members of the community, with the strategic precision she had been developing since November of 1879. The addition gave her a 2nd room and allowed her to separate the older students from the younger ones and begin a more systematic progression of education. She hired a 2nd teacher, a young man named David Holloway fresh from a normal school in Austin, and watched him carefully for the first 2 months until she was sure he was competent and kind, which were the only 2 requirements she had insisted upon with the county. She also continued writing her letters to the county superintendent and eventually to the State Board of Education, patient and specific and cumulative in their effect, because she was building an argument the same way Theodore built a field, one cleared rock at a time. In the autumn of 1881, she discovered she was expecting again. She told Theodore on a Sunday morning in their kitchen in the same direct way as the first time, and his response was the same essential joy with the same first question, only this time he also said, "James is going to be furious and then fascinated," which was an accurate prediction. James Crawford Fairchild at 2 years old was a solid, curious, emphatic child who had inherited his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and was currently most interested in the activities of the chickens and the mystery of where the creek went when it went around the bend below the pecan trees. When the new baby arrived in the spring of 1882, a girl they named Eleanor Margaret Fairchild, Margaret for Abigail's own mother who had died when Abigail was 12, James received her with the precise mixture of wariness and proprietorial pride that Theodore had predicted. Eleanor was from her earliest months a child of considerable personality, which delighted Abigail and amused Theodore, and caused James to develop strong opinions about everything, apparently in response to competition. The Fairchild homestead at Crawford Creek by the summer of 1882 was a working reality, a proper farm with a proper house and a garden, and an orchard beginning to take shape, and a stand of winter wheat that had finally settled into the rhythm of the land, and was producing reliably. Theodore had the gray at his temples that outdoor work in the Texas sun produces in men in their mid-30s, and it suited him. Abigail at 29 had the particular quality of a woman who has built her own life in a place she chose and knows what she has done. They still had their Sunday afternoons at the creek. They still talked about everything, and nothing in the particular frequency that had established itself between them from that first dinner at the Redrock Hotel. The children came into the Sunday afternoons as natural additions, James wading in the shallows with the single-minded intensity of a small scientist and Eleanor carried in Abigail's arms, or set on the limestone rock with a studied concentration on whatever was before her. Eli and Clara Washington remained their closest friends. Eli's carpentry business had grown to the point where he was employing 2 apprentices, one of whom was Samuel, now 11, and showing his father's eye for measurement and precision. Ruth Washington was 9 and one of Abigail's best readers, a fact that Abigail mentioned with specific pride whenever anyone implied that certain children had inherent limitations, which people continued to imply, and which she continued to address with the same unhurried certainty she applied to everything that required correction. Augustus Webb died in the spring of 1882 at the age of 64, a natural death after a brief illness, mourned genuinely by most of Redrock, because he had been a fair man in a country where that was not guaranteed. His son Charles took over the Webb Ranch and proved himself a reasonable continuation of his father's approach, which was a relief to the county. Sheriff Dunmore retired the same year, and the town elected a new sheriff named Isaac Beale, who was younger and considerably more engaged in the actual work of the office, which improved the general quality of Redrock's civic life in measurable ways. Theodore served on the town council beginning in 1882, elected by a vote that surprised him and did not surprise Abigail, and he brought to the council meetings the same thoughtful directness he applied to everything, which made him useful even when it made him inconvenient. In 1883, Abigail's brother William came from Houston to visit, the first time she had seen him in 5 years. He was a year younger than Abigail, a slight man with their same chestnut hair, and a restless energy that made him seem perpetually about to leave, which Abigail recognized as a family trait that she had expressed differently than he had. He arrived on the stagecoach, and Abigail met him at the hotel, and they looked at each other for a long moment with the specific quality of siblings who have been apart long enough to see each other as adults for the first time. William took one look at Crawford Creek and said, very quietly, "Father would have been glad." Abigail looked at her grandfather's land with the orchard trees coming in and the house solid on the south slope and the creek running clear over the limestone, and she said, yes, he would. William stayed for 2 weeks and was good with James, and enchanted by Eleanor, and had long conversations with Theodore about cattle and land management that began cautiously and became easy. And by the end of the 2 weeks, he shook Theodore's hand with genuine warmth and told Abigail that she had managed things very well, which was William's highest form of praise, and which Abigail received with the affectionate exasperation of a woman who has known a person their whole life. He wrote twice a year from Houston and came again in 1885, and once more in 1887, and each visit was longer and more comfortable than the last. And eventually he brought a wife, a Louisianan woman named Cecile who had very decided opinions about cooking and a genuine fondness for children, and the extended Fairchild family became something with weight and warmth to it. The second half of the 1880s were building years for Redrock and for the Fairchild homestead together. The county's population grew as the railroad pushed further west, and the open-range cattle business began its transformation into the more settled farming and ranching landscape that would characterize the next century. Theodore adapted to these changes with the practical intelligence of a man who had always understood that the land required attention to its own rhythms rather than the imposition of a predetermined plan. He hired a ranch hand in 1885, a young man of 22 named Matthew Crane from East Texas, who was a good worker and a quick learner, and who became part of the household's daily rhythms with the ease of someone who fit the place. Matthew ate supper with the family on Sundays and developed a devoted attachment to James, now 6, who received it with the regal magnanimity of a child who is accustomed to being found interesting. Eleanor at 3 was already showing the particular combination of her parents' characteristics that expressed itself as an absolute fearlessness about new things and a passionate investment in understanding them. She followed Theodore around the farm with the focused attention of a student who is not willing to miss anything, and he talked to her about what he was doing with the same thoroughness he used with adults, because she responded to that thoroughness with an engagement that made it worthwhile, and also because he could not imagine speaking to her in any other way. Abigail watched these interactions from the porch or the kitchen door or wherever she was working, and the thing she felt was too large and too familiar by now for its individual components to be separable. It was the sum of Theodore Fairchild and James and Eleanor, and Crawford Creek and the school and the pecan trees and the Sunday afternoons, and it was a life that she had built with her own hands and her own choices, fully and without apology, and it was everything she had ever wanted it to be. In the spring of 1886, Abigail's school was recognized by the State Board of Education as a model rural school, the result of years of the patient, strategic campaign she had been conducting through her letters, and through the increasingly influential voices of the parents whose children had prospered under her instruction. The recognition came with a small financial grant that she immediately applied to the purchase of a new and comprehensive set of textbooks, because recognition without practical resources was less interesting to her than recognition with them. David Holloway had proven himself entirely worthy of the trust she had placed in him, and was now, 8 years after his arrival, a skilled and committed teacher with a specific gift for the older students and the practical mathematics of land and business that she had always intended to be part of the curriculum. He had married a woman from San Antonio in 1883 and had children of his own now, and his family was part of the fabric of Redrock in the way of people who put down real roots. The town had grown. The Dusty Boot had been joined by a second saloon and a proper hotel that was larger and more comfortable than the Redrock Inn, though the Redrock Inn remained open under Clive Morton's management, and Theodore and Abigail still had occasional suppers there, with the particular private affection of people marking a significant location. There was a doctor now, a woman from Pennsylvania named Dr. Sarah Kimball, who had come in 1884, and whose presence in a town of that size and character in that year and place was a remarkable fact that Redrock had debated for approximately 2 months before accepting, because she was clearly very good and clearly not interested in leaving. Dr. Kimball and Abigail became immediate friends on the basis of mutual recognition, 2 women doing serious professional work in a place that required them to be twice as good at it as their male counterparts, and doing it with an equanimity that came from having made the decision some time before that equanimity was more useful than anger, though the anger was also available when required. On a warm evening in September of 1887, exactly 9 years after the stagecoach from San Antonio had deposited Abigail Crawford on the main street of Redrock, Texas, Theodore and Abigail sat on the porch of the house at Crawford Creek in the last of the light. James was 9 now, and he was inside the house at the kitchen table working on the arithmetic problem that his mother had set him, doing it with the focused application of a child who understood that the problem was real and the answer would be useful, which was the way Abigail had always taught him to approach it. Eleanor was 5 and asleep already, or she was supposed to be, and there was a light visible under her door that suggested she had smuggled a candle in and was looking at the picture book she had borrowed from the school's lending library, and Abigail was choosing to consider this a positive sign of intellectual curiosity and not a matter requiring immediate intervention. The crickets were in full voice and the September air had the first faint note of autumn in it, not cold but different, the particular shift that said the worst of the summer was behind and the best of the year was beginning. Theodore reached over in the dark and took Abigail's hand, and she turned it to hold his back, and they sat in the quiet of their own made life. 9 years ago today, he said. I know, she said. I have been thinking about what you looked like walking out of that alley, he said. With your satchel and your derringer and your absolute composure, she laughed. I was not entirely composed, she said. I was considerably more agitated than I appeared. You appeared completely composed, he said. I know, she said. That is the relevant part. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, a quiet and habitual tenderness that was as characteristic of their daily life as anything else. I thought when I saw you that I had never seen anything so remarkable, he said. I still think that. Every day I think it more rather than less. She turned in her chair to look at him in the evening dark, the angles of his face familiar and beloved, the gray more pronounced at his temples now and entirely right on him. Theodore Fairchild, she said. Yes, he said. You are the best thing that has happened to me, she said. You and this land and these children and this life, you are the best thing. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned over 9 years held everything they were in this place. We built it, he said. We built it, she agreed. Inside the house, a light went out under a door, which meant either that Eleanor had finally fallen asleep or that she had heard her parents come to the end of their conversation and had extinguished the candle in response, which was equally possible and equally satisfying as an outcome. James's lamp was still on, the small rectangle of it showing at the kitchen window, and after another few minutes it went out too. The stars appeared over the ridge in the deep clear sky of a Texas September night, the same enormous sky that had been over this creek, and this limestone, and these pecans when Abigail's grandfather had first stood on this ground, with the ambition of building something that would last. The creek ran in the dark, steady and clean over the rock, making the sound it always made, the sound that was now so woven into the fabric of their days that Theodore and Abigail heard it the way you hear your own heartbeat, without noticing until you attend to it, and then with a deep and settling recognition. Theodore held Abigail's hand in the September dark, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built on the land that bore her name and watched the stars come out one by one over the ridge. And there was nothing unfinished between them, no loose ends and no unresolved questions, only the complete and living reality of a life that two people had made together with their hands and their choices and their particular irreplaceable selves. In the years that followed, the Fairchild homestead at Crawford Creek became a fixture of Redrock's landscape in the way of things that have earned their place. The orchard came to full bearing in the late 1880s, and Abigail's preserves and Theodore's smoked meats became items that the general store stocked, by that time run by Pettit's son, who had more business sense than his father and who had stopped watering down the molasses entirely. James Fairchild grew up with his mother's mind and his father's hands, equally comfortable with a book and with a tool, and showed an interest in the law that surprised no one who knew Abigail's capacity for argument and Theodore's fundamental insistence on fairness. Eleanor Fairchild grew up to be precisely herself, which was a considerable amount of person, with her father's patience in all matters, except the ones that mattered, and her mother's complete absence of apology for being exactly who she was. She was her mother's unofficial assistant at the school by the time she was 10, and her formal apprentice by the time she was 16. And at 20, she would take over the Saturday sessions from David Holloway when he retired, which was a development that delighted Abigail and confirmed every assessment of Eleanor she had ever made. Eli and Clara Washington's children grew and prospered, and Samuel Washington's carpentry business eventually surpassed his father's in scope, though never in the quality that Eli had established as a baseline, and Ruth Washington married a schoolteacher from San Marcos and raised 4 children of formidable intelligence in a house that Samuel built for her on the good side of town. Theodore Fairchild served on the Redrock Town Council until 1894, when he declined to stand for re-election because he thought it was time for younger voices, and spent the years he had given to that work on the farm instead, deepening the soil and the orchard and the particular quality of attention he gave to the land under him. Dr. Sarah Kimball remained in Redrock and delivered, among many others, Abigail's 3rd child, a boy born in 1889 whom they named Thomas William Fairchild. William for Abigail's brother and Thomas for no one in particular except that it suited him, and who arrived in the world with an enthusiasm for noise that suggested he was going to have opinions about things, which he did. The house at Crawford Creek was 4 rooms and a summer kitchen and a proper porch and a woodshed and a barn by the time it was finished being built, which was never quite, because a working farm is a thing in permanent process, always something to add or improve or think about. And Theodore Fairchild was a man whose satisfaction in a project lived as much in the doing as in the completion. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in October of 1898, Theodore and Abigail rode out to the flat limestone rock by the creek in the October afternoon, the same rock where he had proposed 19 years before on a September Sunday. The pecans were turning. The water was lower in the dry October than it had been in that September long ago, but it ran clear and sweet over the limestone as it always had. They had brought the same kind of lunch he had packed in his saddlebag that first day they rode out here together, bread and dried beef and apples and cold water in a jar, and they ate it in the dappled light of the turning trees with their backs against the familiar rock and the creek sound around them. Abigail was 46 now, and the years were in her face in the way that years in a working life are, present and honest and not diminishing. Theodore was 51 with the full gray at his temples and the good, weathered look of a man who has been outdoors most of his life. They were still recognizably themselves, recognizably the 2 people who had sat on this rock in September of 1879 and talked about what the house would look like when it was finished. And there was a continuity between those people and these that was not simply the passage of time, but was the accumulation of all the days they had lived inside it together. 20 years, Theodore said, and 3 months from when we met, Abigail said. You remember the months, he said. I remember everything, she said. You know that. He did know that. He had always known that. It was one of the 1,000 specific things he knew about Abigail Crawford Fairchild that were as fundamental to his understanding of his own life as the names of the fields or the schedule of the creek's flooding in a wet spring. Are you glad? He asked, not because he did not know the answer but because he liked to hear it. She turned and looked at him with those hazel eyes, still shifting between green and brown in different light, still holding the direct and complete attention that had stopped him in his tracks on the porch of the Redrock Hotel 20 years ago. Theodore Fairchild, she said. I have built a school that has taught 300 children to read and do arithmetic and understand the world they live in. I have 3 children who are good and smart and brave and kind. I have this land and this creek and these trees that will stand after we are gone. I have the best friend and the truest partner I have ever known in any form or version of a human being. She paused. Ask me again if I am glad. He looked at her, this woman who had driven her elbow into a man's jaw in a Texas alley in July of 1878 with complete composure, who had built a school and a life and a family and a place with the same resolute, purposeful energy that had made him certain in 5 minutes that she was the one he wanted beside him. He took her hand in both of his and held it. I am glad, he said, every day, every single day. The creek ran over the limestone. The pecan leaves turned in the October light. Somewhere up on the ridge, a hawk made its clean, ascending sound, and the sky above the hill country of Texas was the particular deep blue of an October afternoon, clear and vast and entirely itself. Theodore Fairchild and Abigail Crawford Fairchild sat beside the creek that bore her name on the land they had made their own, in the country they had chosen for every right reason, and the 20 years were all present between them, and not one moment of them wasted. And there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unsaid, nothing between them but the full and complete and enduring thing they had built together. As solid and real as the limestone under the water and the stone of the fireplace in their home, and the roots of the pecan trees that would still be standing 100 years from then, holding that good Texas ground.